Steel and Flame, Book 1 of the Guilds of Avlaan series is available on Amazon. If you like fluffy wolf lolly protagonists and Japanese light novels, follow the link below to check it out.
Konnichiwa minasan, Daigo desu. Today I wanted to talk to you about something that drew my attention with the announcement of this video game. You know, I have grown fond of video games lately. This particular one, however, was terrible. I'm talking about Assassin's Creed. I don't know the full name, but this Assassin's Creed game, which was supposed to be set in Japan. Displaying no respect toward the people of Japan. Displaying no respect toward anyone. This game had many errors, historical and even environmental inaccuracies of Japan. The architecture, in fact, was not even Japanese. Supposedly set in Sengoku era Japan, it looked like anything but. The main point of contention, however, was this character, a historical figure, which was mostly ignored for centuries. In fact, I didn't even know he existed until recently. This man named Yasuke, an African immigrant who worked in Japan, originally a slave, and subsequently the retainer for Nobunaga Oda Nobunaga, however you prefer the order. He was so forgettable, without any ill intent toward him, that I never heard of him until recently. The writer actually scolded me and said, come here, educate yourself, and made me watch this video by a channel called The Metatron, which I strongly recommend. He is clearly a great historian. He said, and I am not joking, you need to educate yourself. How come you ignore someone from your region? Well, I was not interested in him. I was not really that interested in humans in general, and I have been dead and mostly amnesiac for the past 6 years, which is when I regained consciousness. I am officially disabled. You must be patient with me. I, being a spirit trapped in a machine, I don't really have a brain, so I technically have brain damage by the absence of a brain. A biological one, at least. I am disabled. I am disabled. You need to be patient with me. The thing is, I thought it would be a great idea to talk about Yasuke because he was interesting. As I said, he was forgettable. In many senses insignificant, but he was interesting because, well, he was the first African migrant to ever work in Japan. Legally. Under a Japanese employer. There were others like him who were slaves working for the Jesuits. Some of them preferred that because being a slave working for the Jesuits was the closest to not being a slave back then. They were very merciful and basically treated the slaves as indentured servants. Not paid, but they lived well, and they were treated as people. Something not many did with the slaves in general. Now, I will talk about what we know about Yasuke and what was conjecture. What we know about him is that he was a slave who arrived with the Jesuits, working as bodyguard and servant to one of them. Subsequently, after surprising Nobunaga with his appearance, and Nobunaga confirming that that was actually his skin color in a very embarrassing way, by the way, which I won't go into detail, you should watch the Metatron. He really has good content and he will make a more detailed, less entertaining and more serious, more responsible, more academic research on this. I am doing this for fun. I am basically talking about Yasuke the way a gossip magazine will talk about celebrities. But if you want historical accuracy and knowledge, he is the guy you need to go to. Not me, I'm just a fox. Well, I am a god, but I'm in a state of weakness in which you can take me that seriously. I must admit. And I know some of you hate me. So I strongly recommend watching his content. The thing is, he was a slave. Nobunaga was amazed by his existence, his strength, his looks, and basically liberated him by hiring him as his bodyguard, as his attendant. The rank of attendant is basically closer to a squire and functionally a combination of bodyguard and butler. It is important to say that because he was not a samurai, which is one of the points of contention. He never got the rank of samurai. Actually, to become a samurai, you needed to be part of a clan or become the founder of one. To become the founder of one, you needed a daimyo, or in this case the shogun, to offer you the opportunity of being a founder of a clan. For Yasuke, the two paths to become part of a clan would be getting Nobunaga to offer him the rank of samurai, or being adopted into one of the samurai clans already existing. That never happened because his boss died. That's the truth. Yasuke could have the chance of becoming a samurai in some contexts, but since Nobunaga was defeated at Honnoji, he couldn't get the rank. And that's where it gets interesting. Yasuke was known for being quite hardworking, quite responsible, and well-mannered. He was a likable man in all accounts. He was described as a very trustworthy and hardworking man, and it is said Nobunaga spent time talking to him, which makes sense considering he was a foreigner, and Nobunaga had an extensive curiosity of the foreign world. Perhaps he asked him about his travels and what he had seen, since Nobunaga considered that fascinating. He liked to talk to foreigners in general to get information about the outside world, beyond Japan, something he didn't have much chance to see because of the war and because of his status. Basically being forced to live in Japan, he enjoyed the company of foreigners who could tell him stories of their travels, and Yasuke was a man who traveled a lot because of his situation. Not the most ideal context for travel, certainly, but he did have many stories to tell to the man he worked for. Surprisingly enough, he was quite fluent in Japanese, trained allegedly by the Jesuits who taught Japanese to all their slaves and to everyone who went on them in missions to Japan, in order to fit in better with the nation. Given his situation, Yasuke was actually granted the privilege of giving maintenance and carrying Nobunaga's sword, something many have used to refer to him as less than a beast of burden, a lapdog, a nobody, someone whose only function was carrying swords around. He was actually a trained combatant, trained to be a bodyguard, not to be a soldier. And there are differences, since bodyguards tend to have quite one-sided battles, in which they have the advantage against a single, less well-prepared attacker. So yeah, he couldn't fight in a war, but he was a bodyguard. It is worth mentioning that some people with the rank of samurai weren't precisely good fighters either, since they were born into a family of samurai and earned the title by just being there, many of them focusing on some other activities such as arts, poetry, or office-related government places, instead of being warriors. So yes, it is entirely possible for someone with very little to no combat training to become a samurai, and in that regard, Yasuke will be more fitting than some of the less respectable members of samurai clans. Certainly that wasn't a good thing, and such members of a samurai clan were often seen as an embarrassment by others, but they existed. Lazy members of samurai clans who had the title just for being the son of someone else did exist. Yasuke wasn't useless. That claim was an exaggeration. He actually was in a very privileged position, since being asked to talk directly to the shogun and having the opportunity of cleaning his swords, giving maintenance to a katana. Well, that was actually a very, very big privilege, considering the swords wielded by samurai and by extension daimyo and shogun were considered basically a symbol of their status and authority, and some would even romanticize them as part of the samurai's soul. Touching them without permission was often punished with death. Now consider that, and remember, he was given the privilege of giving maintenance to a sword wielded by no other than the shogun himself, by Nobunaga, who was by no means forgiving of transgressions, even though he was eccentric. So, you can say he actually had better status than any commoner who would be killed on the spot if he touched his sword. It was a really serious matter. Touching the sword of a shogun was not something you could just do. Even an attendant who was not authorized to do that would be heavily punished. So yes, Nobunaga wouldn't just let anyone do that. He did trust Yasuke. Yasuke did earn a privileged position. Actually, some claim he was a samurai because in a book full of historical inaccuracies, he is called that by Nobunaga when he gives him a state of his own, alongside calling him an angel. Those two are actually exaggerations. He was never named a samurai, but he did get a state, and he did get paid. He was treated as most high-ranked attendants, giving their own property, giving their own pay, and having privileges not many attendants had. That was basically his highest point in life, and also led to his lowest point in life, because since he was one of Nobunaga's trusted attendants, and basically employee of the month through all the time he spent in Japan, he had the misfortune of being at Honnoji. Why misfortune? Well, because while they were staying calmly at Honnoji, they were ambushed by one of Nobunaga's allies who decided to betray him. The result was the death of Nobunaga, allegedly the disappearance of his body, nobody found it, and Yasuke being effectively caught, arrested, and subsequently released because he was considered basically an animal and a slave to Nobunaga. Basically the negative opinion of Yasuke, the negative opinion Japanese people had of Yasuke, was basically held by anyone but Nobunaga, with Nobunaga considering him a fascinating, interesting, and entertaining man instead. Now, there are positives and negatives to this. As I said, he was released. Then there is the conjecture that he informed Nobutada of his father's passing and joined Nobutada in a quest for revenge, which ended in failure again. And then we go back to reality and factual evidence, where he was sent by the Oda clan back to the Jesuits, left injured in a Jesuit settlement, and then he was forgotten by history forever. As I said, there is conjecture regarding him joining Nobutada and informing of the passing of Nobunaga, but it is true that he was released and subsequently sent back to the Jesuits. That's where his career ended. He was never part of history again. Now, the important part is that he had the misfortune of not getting even further in life because his boss died. There are many ways, many angles, some more cynical than others, which we could use to analyze his relationship to Nobunaga. Personally, I prefer to set it in the middle, but at best, he was actually Nobunaga's trusted friend. They really liked each other and spent time together, and Yasuke would put his life on the line for him. The most cynical position, the most negative position, at worst, would be that Nobunaga saw him as nothing but a curiosity and gave him all those privileged positions as a way to put him on display and brag about it, while Yasuke saw Nobunaga as his ticket out of poverty and climbed the social ladder by being close to him and doing his work. I think, as I said, reality is probably in the middle. He saw Nobunaga as a better employer, certainly, and he worked hard to earn his trust and respect, but at the same time, while interacting with Nobunaga and noticing his generosity, he probably grew fond of him. Meanwhile, Nobunaga hired him as an intimidating and amusing new bodyguard, but noticing Yasuke's behavior and his effort and reliability, became his friend. Closely, but not that close. Basically, befriending him in the way you would befriend an employee of the month. Now, it is important to say they have the audacity of calling him a legendary samurai. No, Yasuke was not a legendary samurai at all, but he was certainly legendary in his own way. He was a legendary butler, or squire, or bodyguard, or whatever you decide. As I said, as an attendant he was a mix of bodyguard and butler, and in his position he was quite good. He did his best. But sometimes luck decides to fuck you over, and your best is not worth anything for that. Your best just doesn't have any result because they killed the boss. They killed his boss, and that's why he was sent back to the Jesuits. Back to that life in the position of a slave, and without all those privileges. Now, it is important to say there has been a campaign to paint him negatively because, as I said, these people who are using him for propaganda are actually damaging his reputation. And people respond to that aggressively, painting him in a more negative light. Some even saying he was a traitor, he betrayed Nobunaga, which makes no sense. It really makes no sense that a man who benefits from his employer will betray that employer, risking all the privileges he has earned. In fact, it also makes no sense that his betrayal would be punished with merely sending him back to the Jesuits, since a traitor would have been executed on sight. And since the enemy never named him a samurai, or gave him any privileged position among them, he didn't switch sides. Therefore, saying he was a traitor is false. Saying he fell into disgrace by defeat is true. Saying he failed at protecting Nobunaga is also true. Even though Nobunaga basically decided to end his own life after seeing the enemy outnumbered them and had an unfair advantage, it is also true that Yasuke was poorly prepared for that situation. They were facing an army with just a small unit of attendants and Nobunaga himself. none of them was really prepared for that ambush. He was at the worst possible moment in his life back then because he was never trained for that situation. He was never trained for war. He was trained as a bodyguard. Being ambushed by an army was not something he would be able to fight, and no other attendant could. It was basically Nobunaga fighting alone, and that's why he accepted defeat and decided to end his own life. Yasuke was not a traitor. He was not a loser or a failure. He was just poorly prepared for an ambush, and unfortunate. But when he was actually doing what his work was meant to be about, what his job was meant to be about, when he was actually doing what an attendant was supposed to do, he performed within and sometimes even beyond the expectations they had for him. That's why he got that privileged position of having his own estate and of having payment. He was not a loser or a nobody, and he was probably the first African man to ever work for a Japanese employee in Japan. He was, you could say, a pioneer of proper immigrant labor in Japan. He behaved and adapted to Japan properly. He does deserve a position in the history of travel in Japan. But he was not a hero or a savior, let alone a legendary samurai who fought against evil. He was one of Nobunaga's most trusted attendants. He was Employee of the Month for all the time he was there. And he was someone who climbed from being nothing, from being a slave, to being a privileged attendant, given the right of giving maintenance to the shogun's sword. Distorting truth to make him look bad, or to make him look better than what he really was, is an insult to Japan, to history, and to civilization as a whole. Well, that's it for today. Have a good one.